Reich. I'm a researcher at the Department of Interdisciplinary Studies of Cultures and supporting the coordination of Team Society. Team Society is one of the teams under New Energy who are joining us today. And we are focusing on both advancing social science and humanities research on energy and also showcasing this research to a broader audience. Today's webinar will be on the changing same of power, state territoriality and natural gas market liberalization in Thailand. And the speaker is Alexander Dodge, who is Associate Professor at the Department of Geography. And we have also a discussant with us, William Tronson from the Department of Interdisciplinary Studies of Culture. So Alexander, I give the word to you.
Hey, just share my screen. Right, all right. So, thanks again for this opportunity to present. As I said, it's great to have a chance to present to other researchers at NTNU who are outside my discipline. So thanks for that. Today I'm going to be presenting an article that I wrote called "The Changing Same of Power: State Territoriality and Natural Gas Market Liberalization in Thailand." This article is based on around a month's field work that I did in Bangkok, Thailand in 2017. I actually was able to do it based on a cooperation I had with the Norwegian Embassy in Thailand. They were interested in learning more sort of about the natural gas market in Thailand, and they helped me book some interviews with planning authorities, regulatory authorities, energy companies, and energy consultants in Thailand. So I looked a bit at these politics surrounding natural gas market deregulation in Thailand, which at first you would think is quite a dry topic, not much interesting to explore, but actually, when I went into sort of the politics of it and the history of it, it's actually something quite interesting to discuss, mainly because of the ideas around politics and incumbency in the sector. So just to give you some sort of highlights on what the contribution of this article is. What this article is doing is it's developing an analytical approach that can help energy researchers explain why the successful implementation of energy policy is geographically differentiated according to different national contexts. In geography, we look quite a lot on how different socio-spatial processes shape and form energy systems. And we intend, by alluding to these processes, we're looking at understanding more the spatial configurations of scales and organization in energy systems, in addition to highlighting some of the geographical differences. And what I tried to do here is to identify and demonstrate sort of the different arrangements by which powerful actors or incumbents may reproduce their control and authority within energy systems over time. And specifically, I'm discussing different ways we can conceptualize the relationships between power and space, the geographical sense of space in relation to energy systems. So I'm just going to give a little brief background on natural gas in Thailand. I'll give a theoretical presentation of what I mean by territorial and topological notions of power, which serves as the analytical framework for this paper. Discuss sort of the history of natural gas sector reform in Thailand. And then I'll discuss more this sort of changing same of power, which I refer to in the title, and what exactly I mean by that. And I'll give my final thoughts at the end. So natural gas in Thailand, the first offshore gas field was discovered in 1973. Natural gas accounts for a fairly significant mix in electricity generation, around 55%, even more previously. However, domestic natural gas production is declining. It's declining for a while. The country in around the 1990s was starting to import natural gas from Myanmar via pipelines, and now they're starting to import natural gas through liquefied natural gas terminals, which they're importing from, places like Qatar in the United States. And the sector is virtually monopolized by the national energy company called PTT. PTT is a huge company. It's one of the only Thai companies that's on the Forbes 500 list. Extremely sort of large actor that's part of many sort of daily sort of happenings in Thailand. And anybody you ask in Thailand is well aware of this company. It sort of affects the everyday life of Thailand, because basically it has a virtual monopoly over the natural gas sector in Thailand. It's procuring the gas, distributing that, and marketing it. So it has 55% of electricity generation really controlled by one large company. But of course, historically, most countries have had a monopolized natural gas market. And Thailand is no exception. But around the 1980s in the United States and Europe, countries have started to deregulate the industry, break monopolies, introduce competition into the sector. And Thailand hasn't been excluded from this process. These sort of initiatives to reform the natural gas sector has occurred since the 1990s. But despite attempt after attempt after attempt, PTT remains to have a large control over the sector. So that's sort of the basis of the article, is trying to explain why the natural gas sector in Thailand continues to be monopolized despite these liberalization attempts. So, and to be able to understand sort of the nature of this incumbency and why this incumbency manages to sort of maintain its reach into sort of the everyday lives of Thai people through its control of the natural gas sector, I use what I call these notions of territorial and topological notions of power. And territorial notions of power, they're conceptualizing power as extended outward over mappable distance. When you see the map of the nation state, for example. And power under these notions may be instrumental in terms of sort of the legal and regulatory authorities of governments, whose reach over resources and infrastructure is normally extensive to the borders of the nation state. However, topological notions of power, they're less concerned with these physical and mappable distances and are entertaining the idea of non-mappable relational distances, relational proximities, relational distances that can be composed, shaped, distorted through what one would call intensive arrangements of power. And by you drawing upon these intensive arrangements of powers, essentially what powerful actors are able to do is manipulate outcomes to their advantage by placing certain possibilities within or outside the reach of others in relational space. So, and they don't necessarily rely on these sort of blunt forms of instrumental power that the territorial sort of arrangements of power do. So to give you a sense more of what this territorial notion of power means, we can discuss about the territoriality of energy systems, which is referring to how political and economic actors are exercising authority and commercial power over energy systems by delimiting and asserting their control over space. And this is something that's quite prevalent to the natural gas sector. Natural gas as a sector has been traditionally territorialized at the level of the nation states. It hasn't always been like that. For example, pre-1930s in the United States, it was largely a free market kind of system. But what happened in that free market system is that powerful actors who had both control over the pipelines, interstate pipelines that were transporting natural gas, and were also the ones producing and selling natural gas. And it creates a kind of natural monopoly situation where, because you have access to the networked infrastructure, you're basically blocking competitors from entering. And what would happen is, because of that situation, small-time producers who didn't have access to these pipelines would just waste the gas into the atmosphere in order to instead focus on getting quite small quantities of oil that don't rely on this networked infrastructure to produce. So because of that natural monopoly situation, the United States government passed the 1938 Natural Gas Act in the US, which regulated the market to a much greater extent and put a lot of the authority onto the federal government. So that's one way we can understand the territorialization. We can also understand it in terms of the modern states legally and military seizing parts of the surface of the earth and encasing resources within its technical managerial apparatus. So I'll discuss a bit how that relates to the Thai case. Resources, of course, also constitutes a cultural imagery of shared nationhood. I think anyone in Norway sort of understands this connection between oil and nationhood in a way. And also the modernization of the nation as a political project has been tied with this re-territorialization of energy infrastructure at the scale of the nation. So for example, before 1950s in Netherlands, natural gas was mainly a municipal system with different local gas producers producing within the sort of municipality itself. But after the discovery of the Groningen gas fields, the Dutch government played quite a key role together with Exxon and Shell in order to establish an institutional framework that would re-territorialize the natural gas sector at the level of the nation states. So, but of course, nothing's that easy, and the territorial state is quite highly ambiguous and contradictory. It includes accommodating or contesting forms of territorial rules itself. In terms of the natural gas industry, putting more weight on EU regulators and deregulating sort of the national natural gas systems. The growth of liquefied natural gas is a way of sort of connecting natural gas systems to other sources of fuels and energy beyond sort of the control of the state and beyond the, for example, inter-country pipelines have certain diplomatic relations behind them, but liquefied natural gas sort of upends those kind of aspects. So there is this territorialization, but there's a continuous sort of deterritorialization occurring as well. But the problem with these territorial notions of power is, in some way, they can only take us so far, because they are mainly concerned of what actors can do given certain resources, a legal authority over territory. But the sort of actual workings of power might get missed within this framework. And focusing on sort of actual workings of power entails understanding how different actors act upon and respond to contingencies that confront them, such as price shifts, declining energy resources, new policies. So, for example, when these blunt displays of power, this legal authority over territory, is no longer successful, powerful actors might do better to establish their advantage through what we'd call quieter registers of power, being able to manipulate events in ways that enable them to reproduce their presence by, for example, drawing other actors into their relational proximity. So this is this notion of this changing same of power. which is drawing attention to more, instead of extensive arrangements of power that are reaching across space, intensive arrangements of power are types of power that work through non-metric relational distances that are constitutive of space. And this notion of topology is basically borrowing from the mathematical understanding of topologies, not in order to do models in the topological sense, but at least borrowing some of the metaphors. So if anybody who know topology, obviously this is completely, far off from the mathematics, but still the idea here is that the mathematical sort of metaphors can be useful for understanding power. And in mathematics, topology is concerned with the properties of geometric objects that are preserved under continuous deformations, such as stretching, twisting, crumpling, bending, but not necessarily tearing or gluing in that kind of sense. And it's taking this understanding of equivalence and as invariance as power as something that can be reproduced through senses of spatial distortion. And what that means is to be able to place certain possibilities within reach, to draw others within its orbit, or to seek advantage, or equally placing possibilities out of the reach of other actors. So it's a question on how actors are using technologies to create a simultaneous presence in a diversity of settings, so that the gap between here and there is bridged relationally. And those of you who are STS scholars, something like this is not too far out, in the sense that these intensive arrangements of power also focus on how material artifacts such as regulatory codes, audits, calculative agencies, contracts, pricing regimes can be used to mediate relationships between states and corporations, stakeholders, and publics. So we're also drawing on Foucault and Latour in this conceptualization of power. But it differs in the sense that reach over space through these socio-technical networks is not uncomplicated, that there is a sense of relational proximities that must be created through these mediums in order to sort of manipulate outcomes in favor of powerful actors. So what I'm suggesting here is, in addition to these territorial notions of power, to account for relationships between actors and material objects, such as gas transmission codes, gas supply contracts, and pricing regimes, and analyze how these relations constitute intensive arrangements of power in natural gas markets. So to sort of go quickly through what this means in the case of Thailand, first, in order to understand the sort of territorialization of natural gas markets, we can point to when Thailand claimed the continental shelf in the Andaman Sea, when it incorporated this 1971 Petroleum Act, which granted it sort of the authority over natural gas markets, the ability to sort of allow private parties or government parties to explore, produce, store, transport, and sell petroleum in concession areas. Thailand also consolidated its authority over natural gas markets through the incorporation of PTT as a state-owned natural gas enterprise that would be basically granted a monopoly over procuring and exploring for and developing and producing petroleum and natural gas. And this abundance of sort of natural gas that Thailand had in its domestic market is adamantly connected to the sort of modernization of the nation state. It's been key in sort of developing a lot of the industry, such as petrochemicals industry, which Thailand has gained a certain amount of wealth on. So, but one of the problems is around the 1980s, the energy system built a lot of debts, which led Thailand to seek emergency assistance from the International Monetary Fund. And as everybody's sort of aware of the World Bank's activity in 1980s, you'll know that a lot of this comes down to structural adjustment funds, where governments are sort of bound to enforce a certain amount of deregulation and privatization in order to gain this assistance. And at the same time, there was a military coup in 1991 who was trying to gain legitimacy in the eyes of the World Bank. So there began this process of privatizing the industry, such as establishing the National Energy Policy Office and making a plan for energy deregulation. And this man in this picture here, Dr. Piasavasti, was sort of a key proponent of this process and was the head of NEPO. And essentially what the natural gas liberalization it entails, first lifting sort of the decision-making out of the national sphere, and instead of focusing on regulated actors who are responsible for the transmission sector, establishing independent regulatory bodies disconnected from the state, but still regulating the transmission system in a way that enables competition, removing pipeline ownership from PTT and the vertically integrated energy companies, and establishing third-party access, which essentially means that transmission operators have to grant a fair way of sort of allocating the ability to use pipelines, for example, so that no actors is sort of excluded in that way. In other words, increasing competition in that sector. So a third-party access regime, you can define it a licensee who owns an energy network system which allow other licenses or energy industry operators to utilize or connect to a system in accordance with the terms stipulated and announced by the licenses. There was this ongoing process, but then in 1997, you had the Asian financial crisis. This caused quite a lot of sort of nationalist backlash against this deregulation and liberalization, which propelled the Thai party led by Thaksin into power. And this era of Thaksin coming into power could be called a national champion era. Thaksin's version of nationalism was quite complicated, but it was opposed to IMF market liberalization reforms. But at the same time, he carried on with the privatization of state-owned enterprises. So PTT was partially incorporated with a 49% equity share floated on the Thai markets, while the government maintained a majority shareholder position of 51%. So he carried into this privatization, but when it came to actually deregulating the natural gas market, introducing competition, he basically that regime basically ignored all the aspects of that. So what happened is basically a partially private actor was given monopoly access over the Thai energy sector, which of course for the shareholders in that company, the new shareholders in that company, is great because it's essentially guaranteed cash flow. And there's been a lot of sort of discussions on the sense of corruption, on how these stocks were allocated, whether they were allocated to allies of the Thaksin regime. So Dr. Piavasidi, he was sort of kicked out. NEPO was made instead of an independent body, it was made back into under the Ministry of Finance, reallocated to the government, and basically the government maintained its extensive authority over the Thai gas system. But this also created quite a lot of backlash, and there was a Supreme Court case against the corporatization of PTT by the Foundation of Consumers, who were saying that this led to an unfair situation, and they wanted the PTT to be renationalized. Thaksin government was ousted through a military coup. Thailand has had a lot of military coups. Dr. Piavasidi was sort of reinstated. And the outcome of this court case was that, so they didn't approve the nationalization of PTT, but what they did approve is that in order for PTT to maintain a semi-private company it would have to give up the pipelines that it controlled back to the states, and the states were supposed to be transferred to the Ministry of Finance. And also this was based on a simultaneous process where the Energy Industry Act, which sort of laid the groundwork for a third-party access regime and energy deregulation, would sort of be carried out. So, but this reform period was short-lived. Basically, the industry was packed, but nothing was really going on. It was quite go slow attitude. There wasn't really much political muster to bring forward these things. But another sort of key challenge was PTT never really gave up its access to the pipelines. It still had what you would call legacy contracts over the pipeline system, particularly the offshore pipeline system going to the domestic gas sources. And what basically entailed is that PTT continued to have a monopoly over the domestic gas resources and imports coming from Myanmar, which meant that there was no sense in which new competitors can come into the market because they had no access to the sources of gas, even though the internal sort of onshore pipeline system was deregulated, the offshore system was still there. So after this passing, it's still been held as a monopoly. So, but the problem, one of the things that's happening now is gas is declining, and Thailand has become more dependent upon importing liquefied natural gas from other countries. So in an effort sort of to try to reduce its dependence on Myanmar, but also to sort of make up for this declining natural gas supply. But what liquefied natural gas does, which didn't happen before, is it essentially deterritorializes the natural gas system, because it allows, because even though PTT continues to have a monopoly over domestic energy sources, the liquefied natural gas allows for new competitors to come in because they can procure the liquefied natural gas themselves and then transport it through the natural gas system. And in combination with the Energy Regulatory Commission, who has the mandate to deregulate the natural gas sector, allows for a possibility of establishing these third-party access. But nevertheless, PTT continues to maintain its monopoly, and there's three ways in which it continues to do so. And basically, so up until now, I've been discussing sort of territorial understandings of power, but it's at this point where I start to discuss these more topological ways in which we can understand power that don't rely on this extensive authority of territory or pipelines or resources, but more how you can use pricing arrangements and contracts to manipulate advantage in your favor. So, for example, one way that PTT continues to maintain its advantage is by manipulating network codes. Usually the transmission operator should be separate from the integrated gas companies. And Thailand has initiated this aspect, but instead of creating two new companies, it created PTT LNG, which has the operative responsibility for the liquefied natural gas terminals. But they only made a legal separation instead of a full ownership separation. So PTT is still owned by, PTT LNG is still owned by PTT, but it's legally separated. But the problem with that is there's something in the third-party access regime, which is called grandfather clauses, which allows old companies or legacy companies to sort of maintain their share of having reserved capacity on LNG and transmission systems. But the idea is that if they're not using any spare capacity, they're supposed to give it up, and that's supposed to be allocated to new competitors. And one of the problems is that PTT is not actually using the capacity fully. So essentially it should go to other competitors, but there are certain days in a season where it is using full capacity. And based on that, based on those days, that this use it or lose it clause hasn't kicked in. And of course, the energy regulator should actually demand that that the use it and lose it clause would kick in. But since PTT LNG is still part of PTT, it's quite I would be quite skeptical that they would actually do that, and they haven't done that. Another problem is the long-term contracts. PTT has signed 15, 20-year contracts with different companies in the sector, and these were signed at the time when PTT was the only supplier available, and therefore no exit clause were designed in the contracts, which means that essentially no natural gas competitors can go into the markets because all the customers still have long-term contracts. So basically what PTT is doing here is maintaining its relational proximity to these natural gas, to the energy companies, while at the same time keeping competitors at a distance, in that sense of creating relational space in its favor. And the third arrangement is the pricing arrangements. Natural gas in Thailand is priced on a sort of pooling policy, which basically pools together the price of Myanmar imports with LNG imports with domestic gas. But the problem is that that's always going to give PTT an advantage, because it's the only one that controls domestic gas, and domestic gas is priced much cheaper than LNG imports and Myanmar imports. And basically what that entails is that they will continuously maintain an advantage in the markets, which again maintains their sort of reach over the market while excluding competitors. So these are just 3 examples of the way that PTT can use different material artifacts to sort of shape and distort relational space in a way that is in its favor. But of course, one thing that's important to know is, even though that they have this capacity to sort of distort the regime in their favor, I mean, the government could initiate policy that would block this from happening, but for some reason they're doing it. For some reason, the government is not initiating this policy, which turns me to the idea that you have to combine these territorial and topological notions of power. They aren't exclusive from each other. They work together. So whether government, and I've been trying to think of the reasons why the government doesn't more forcefully enact them. I don't have really any good answers for that. But I think one thing that's important to know is that whether government's officials are aware of it or not, they're actively reproducing their authority, their sovereignty over Thai gas markets by allowing PTT to keep its monopolies, because PTT is still 51% a government owned. And when you think that this third-party access regime, if you go back to the court case in 2006, that was essentially court mandated, but not politically motivated, you get a better understanding of the sense that this is something that's not really politically interesting in that sense. But what this does do is it's basically allowing PTT to maintain its monopoly through what you would call quieter registers of power. It's much more difficult to mobilize social resistance against these small sort of manipulations of, for example, network codes. Whereas, for example, these blunt displays of power that were before, such as maintaining ownership over pipelines, is something that was much easier for social movement groups such as the Foundation of Consumers to mobilize opposition against. So this might be one reason why these kind of manipulated outcomes are maintained, because it's essentially quiet and difficult to mobilize resistance against. So I'm sorry going over my time, but just some thoughts on why this might be useful for other social scientists, not even if you're looking at liberalization of gas markets, but are looking more at incumbency in general. For one thing, it can help explain why energy laws and regulations aren't always successful. Instead of framing dominance as a virtue of actors' resources or positionalities, we can understand incumbency through these quieter relations of power that can be used, and that aren't necessarily illegal, but are quiet and therefore impede the capacity of social movements to mobilize resistance against. And I think these kind of lessons can be drawn for other senses on, for example, how do incumbents reproduce fossil fuel regimes despite government policies for meeting climate emission targets or decarbonization. Great, thank you.
Thank you very much, Alex, for this interesting talk. And sorry for those of you who had problems connecting to the link. I hope that you're all here now. Yeah, I will give the word directly to William for his comments, questions to Alex.
Yes, thank you very much. Can you all hear me? Good. So thanks, congrats on the paper, which I guess you published last year. And thanks for the talk, which is very interesting. These topics I think are interesting because it ends up being about these massive regulatory battles, which I'm a little bit familiar with coming from the energy field myself, looking at this stuff, how it works in Norway, how, for instance, the network companies that we have here, which are the TSO of our electricity, or the DSOs, how they're trying to argue with regulatory powers, and how it just basically ends up becoming lawyers sitting in a room discussing how this algorithm is supposed to cover costs or not. And it's really, I think it ends up being just a tug of war, I suppose, which can turn into its own little stasis. So I guess probably lawyers have no problem finding work in Thailand in the energy sector. But I want to, yeah, so you were talking about the geographical concepts of territoriality, which is, I guess, sort of a very common concept you geographers deal with. And then you introduced this other thing, which is called, topology. And that's the difference here is you've been talking about is the territoriality deals with extensive power that's sort of flat and moves across maps. Well, you have these other intensive power structures, which are more maybe related to, I guess, classic ideas of power, which is always difficult to talk about in these days. But I think it's very interesting. I think it's it's probably useful, but coming from geography, not coming from geography, maybe this divide is something that's going to be interesting to talk about for us. But let me just fire off a question first, because I think it's interesting to see how this liberalization that's initially happened in the 70s and 80s, it seemed to come from sort of outside pressures, the International Money Fund, the World Bank, and those gangsters. And usually it seemed that this came out of really something as mundane as money problems. So Thailand had money problems, and I'm wondering, why did they end up having money problems while they were just swimming in all that natural gas?
So the money problems were related to the fact that they around the 1980s, before the natural gas sector really sort of came into play, they were using oil for power. And that's around the same time when you had this, Arab embargo crisis and the, huge increase in oil prices. So that's one reason why that accumulated a lot of debts. And the other reason was low energy tariffs that were subsidized, which were also accumulating a lot of debts. And these tariffs were quite difficult to reform. In Thailand, because it was also for industrial development was important. they wanted to maintain these low energy tariffs, and therefore they were focused on getting emergency assistance from the World Bank to cover the debts and to maintain the electricity tariffs. So basically, the windfalls from natural gas were basically not enough at the time to pay back the debts that they had, and therefore they were forced into this position of seeking monetary assistance from the World Bank. But of course, what Thaksin did is that basically by privatizing PTT, he gained revenue that he could use to sort of avoid these debt obligations. And also spend it on political projects. So that was part of his sort of nationalization scheme, is that he would still privatize these industries in order to not be dependent on IMF assistance.
But he basically said that we're going to privatize it. They're not going to privatize it.
Yeah, basically. So we're going to privatize it. And again, he privatized it 49%. So the government still maintained its majority shareholding.
Which is what we did here as well, I think.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So it's quite similar, but the only difference is that, I mean, Norway is mostly exporting its natural gas, whereas in Thailand, actually, it's both it's producing natural gas and using it in its own natural gas sector, which basically gives PTT a monopoly over the consumer aspects of natural gas as well.
Yeah. And I guess that cheap energy is probably important for political power, or at least it was very important.
Certainly.
Yeah.
Because again, I mean, the petrochemicals industry in Thailand and manufacturing industry was based on this abundance of natural gas for electricity generation and petrochemicals processing.
Jobs, basically.
Yeah.
So I also have this the other question, which I think we talked a little bit about it earlier. How does this relate to? How does this territoriality and the topology ontology you have in geography here relate to STS and the work that we do? And I know there are a lot of STSers here today, so I think that would be interesting, and probably people have questions as well about that. I feel this sort of resonates a little bit with the ontological turn that we've experienced in STS, and I think probably you have as well. And you know, where we deal with the socio-technical, you deal with the socio-spatial, as you said earlier. And I think also we had a discussion a couple of years ago, back when you were before you finished your PhD, about this, how this relates to actor network theory. And obviously there are a lot of overlaps here, I think. For instance, these in the actor network theory, Calon formulated this notion of obligatory passage points. And they actually just, I think in STS terms, quite aptly formulate how this intensive power stuff that you're talking about works. You know, and the obligatory passage point, they are constructed early during a problematizing phase. So, you know, that would be, how are we gonna solve this natural gas? How are we gonna distribute this to the people? How's this gonna be a part of the nation state or nation building? And that would be the problematizing phase. And it's also described as this narrow funnel, actually. So in topological terms, that's actually a very topological artifact, I guess, a funnel. So this defines this action program in the theory of Calon, and it sets up this protected sort of space where they can control the situation in relative terms from the outside or the rest of the global network, which so it's a way of and if you want to talk about power, that's definitely a way you could do it. And also, I think there's a little element there of something spatial, at least. It's not completely removed from a sense that this obligatory passage point is stuck somewhere in space, mostly. It's obviously a conceptual term, but that somebody's sitting somewhere in an office controlling this little and they also have materialities that are related to that. So I guess a question that comes with that is, in terms of geography, what do you think then comes first? Is it power or is it territory?
No, that's a great, and I mean, we were discussing it before because obviously, you know, I would hope that this kind of paper is something that would be interesting for SDS scholars, not only for energy geographers. And you know, as I said, this terminology, topology, is not foreign to, you know, to those who read the works of Latour and Colon, and you know, and these notion of material artifacts aren't foreign to people who've read Foucault, for example. So it's a question of what the terminology of topology means here, and the terminology of topology here is trying to again draw more on this mathematical metaphors, which is basically how can you take a shape and twist it and distort it in ways that make it change, but never really breaking or tearing in that sense. So some classic examples are, I pointed this one out, the Klein bottle, for example, which is basically a rubber tube that's folded into itself, and mathematically you're never breaking in a sense. And the other is the Mobius strip, which is if you trace the line as this ball is doing within the strip, you basically get a continuous edge that's both on the inside and the outside of the shape. Which you do is by simply twisting a piece of paper upon itself in order to get this kind of shape. It's quite easy to do if you have a strip of paper. And the notions here is the spatial distorting, the spatial twisting, in terms of making something different, but at the same time continues to be the same, which is sort of at the heart of this topology approach, which, by the way, is developed by John Allen, who's a well-known geographer in my field. And so for example, the Mobius strip kind of representing a inside and outside, how again, this idea of how possibilities can be both maintained within reach, but also put on the outside, for example. And essentially what I'm trying to get here is that, so the topology in the sort of active network sense is working to the extent that it has the understanding of networks, sort of reaching into sort of the everyday lives of actors. But the reach of these networks is relatively, I would say, uncomplicated. It's kind of assumed that as long as these networks are connected in a certain way, that they're able to maintain reach, as long as these objects are able to mediate this. But so again, we're trying to bring more spatial metaphors in the sense that that tries to understand an actor's powerful reach as something that's not uncomplicated, but that actively needs to be produced through different mediations, such as using material artifacts. So, and I think what this is helpful for SDS scholars. First, it's helpful because it gives a passage point for SDS scholars to kind of go into these, you know, this sort of distinction between a territorial and topological notions of power, maybe bring in some of that more geographical aspects into SDS scholarship. But I think also another important aspect is helping SDS scholars not get lost in scale, because I think this is something that can be quite complicated. That, you know, that often when we're dealing with things such as energy policy, we're dealing with different scales, such a, you know, policy that's implemented at local scales, policy that's implemented at national scales and policy that's implemented at EU level-wide scales. And but of course, you know, these things aren't very, you know, these things are never well structured and well defined, and there's always sort of different relations occurring with scales as sort of energy systems become, the authority of energy systems become allocated to EU-wide regulators, for example, or how some things still maintain on the local, which is why this distinction between using both this territorial and topological notion of power can help us really think through this sort of nitty-gritty aspects of what's happening here, and how actors can sort of work through different regulations at different scales in order to maintain their advantage.
Okay, thanks.
Great. Thank you, William, for your questions, and Alex for your replies. We already have one question from the audience. Arthur, do you want to? Yeah.
Thanks.
Yeah.
Computer day. Thanks, Alex. That's you know, I wanted to pick up, go back to William's comment and take it in a different direction. You know, I mean, you're a geographer. What would you know, what would David Harvey say? You know, so let's say we go into a different direction, and David Harvey he actually does discuss Thailand and Indonesia's financial collapse in comparison to Taiwan and Singapore, which did not, for reasons that he would stake out, or their relation to spatial temporal fixes, accumulation by dispossession, and state power. So these sort of more meaty, you know, traditional Marxist political economic terms that, you know, have their own sort of form of explanation for this story without reference to, with all due respect, you know, the more racy, you know, STS and sort of territorial terms you brought up, you know. So, I mean, just what do you, how do you speak back to those kinds of more sort of, you know, Luxemburgian, neo-Marxian sort of frames of reference for this kind of, as an explanation? Like, can you speak a little bit that stretches at your added value versus, you know, why not take a David Harvey approach to this issue? If the question makes sense.
Yeah, no, I think that definitely does make sense. And I mean, David Harvey also has his notion of time-space compression, for example, how different technologies have sort of enabled reach to occur across space in different ways. So it wouldn't be quite foreign. I mean, but of course, I think the article sort of grasps a lot of that, a lot of those ideas, and sort of the focus on territoriality, because this notion of territoriality that's been developed in geographers and I use in my thesis has kind of at that root these sort of neo-Marxian and capitalist understandings. So for example, Parenti, he talks about how the modern state is created as it puts legally encases resources within its techno-managerial apparatus, and is able to deliver these, and in doing so is able to deliver these resources to capital, which essentially creates the capitalist states. So it's there, and it's there in that territorial discussion that I go into, and normally one would say that this topological and territorial kind of notions of power, they don't fit entirely well with each other. I mean, you can, they're basically two different conceptual sides of an argument. And if you wanted to go into, you know, in a theoretical discussion, you could go into sort of, you know, discussing which one is better than the other in a sense, or which one is more adequate. But I've tried to take a more pragmatic approach in the sense that I think that you can use both of them. And I think John Allen, who wrote the book on it, would also agree that we can play these are just framings of power. They're different ways of playing on different understandings of power in order to explain the phenomenon that we want to explain. So my answer to that question is yes, I would use, you know, I would place, you know, the work of David Harvey and the others who have used his work to understand territory together on the side with these this more topological SDS way of thinking of power with it. If I wanted to do something pragmatically, like explain this case in Thailand here.
Thank you. Then we have Thomas with a question, and if possible, rather brief question and answer.
Thanks a lot. Yeah, I'm getting a bit dizzy by watching this ball spinning around, but I'll try to manage. Yeah, I was kind of interested in yeah, really interesting talk. Thanks a lot. And I wanted to follow up on a quick point by William. I think so. I guess in STS there is this tendency to focus a lot on novelty and innovation and stuff like that. Whereas I think it's pretty interesting here how you then do some of the same while focusing on incumbency and how kind of incumbency is produced over time and maintained and things like that. But so a reflection on the kind of wording that you used towards the end, and I wanted to kind of ask, could you use this topological approach also to study novelty? That's one aspect of it, and the other aspect, I guess, that struck me, that a lot of kind of studies of newcomers do kind of relational studies. They would, I guess, study a lot of this in terms of, you know, innovation and those kinds of things. Whereas there's something about the words that you use there, you know, manipulation, and so is that intentional, that there's kind of different connotations to stuff that you do when you talk about incumbency than I guess you would have if you talked about newcomers here? Just a feeling I have.
Yeah, I mean, I think you're right in the sense I've written this with the thought of incumbents in mind. But I think I mean, again, you know, that's the sort of title, The Changing Saving of Power, because it assumes that power is just being written, is sort of maintained, but in different ways. But there's no, I think the lessons you could draw here could also be drawn for you know, the example that Alan uses is the role of social movements, for example. How do they sort of, because they also have to maintain, global social movements also have to maintain a reach across space. And of course, this reach is, again, not complicated. They have to actively be able to maintain and create relational proximities, allow themselves to sort of maneuver within you know, maneuver within different sort of material artifacts as well, such as protest against pipelines, for example. And I would think that the same would sort of go in regards to new actors, you know, who are bringing in who are in some ways kind of have to disrupt these notions of power from incumbents, and I think to be able to understand it, you would also, in order to understand how new actors are able to sort of create a greater reach for themselves, able to really disrupt, you would have to think of it in a way that's, how can these new actors be aware of these sort of actual relations of power that are reproducing the dominance of incumbents? how do they create their reach? What kind of how are they able to work through legal codes and artifacts in order to create this reach? So I do think you could use it in that opposite sense, because obviously the problem with incumbent, the problem with newcomers will also be in the fact that the sort of legal and territorial authorities being able to work through that will never be kind of enough, in the sense, if you don't understand how really power is working within the sector. I hope that answers the question, kind of. Yeah.
Perfect.
But it was a good question. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. So if there's no other urgent question, I would like to thank all of you for joining. A special thanks to Alex and William, and just announce the next webinar in 2 weeks, which will be about the role of pilot projects in energy transitions. So I hope you will all join.